The following program is presented by the National Committee on United States-China Relations, www.ncuscr.org.
Last week, that we did a similar program in Washington where, as the last portion of the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations, we did a program with former Secretary of the Treasury Mike Blumenthal, where they provided a very nice spread and views of the Capitol Hill from the back. I have to tell the New York office these views aren't quite as nice as the ones in Washington. But again, our friends at Jones, they are terrific, and I don't know what we'd do without. Are we shutting off the lights for any reason? It's okay, guys. We can keep the lights on. Dramatic. It is. This is for dramatic. Well, you know, we're here to celebrate two things today. First, we're here to celebrate kind of the resurgence of interest in Joseph Needham, which has been created by the book, The Man Who Loved China. We're also here to celebrate the publication of an encyclopedia of one of our members, which is the Encyclopedia of China, which 4 of the 5 volumes are right over there on the deck. The 5th volume is in front of Jerry and Joan Cohen, because Joan Cohen provided most of the photographs in these volumes. So she's admiring her own work, which is quite spectacular. I've seen it, and it really is. It's really very nice. And we've got Karen Christensen, who's the publisher of the encyclopedia, there in red in the back row. It's been quite an endeavor, and in a lot of ways, it's here we had Needham, who for years compiled all of these extraordinary volumes. And in a lot of ways, over the years, there have been very few attempts at creating encyclopedias of China, and here Berkshire Publishing and Karen have done that, and it's really terrific, and we're glad to have this event. And I should say Simon Winchester is here because of, he didn't know the National Committee, I think, and Karen urged him to come to kind of celebrate both of these events. Simon, I mean, if I went over all the books and articles that he's written, I think we wouldn't have time for him to say anything, because it's been prolific and it's been wonderful. And this book, I have to say, I read on the beaches of Tortola. Now, some might say, well, that your critical senses may have disappeared at that point, but it really was fun, and it was as if he took me by the hand and he led me through this extraordinary life of Joseph Needham, and kind of this fascinating kind of life, his love of China, and he walks you through this. I don't know, I think most of you have not read the book, but you kind of walk through this life, and with China interacting with the life, and it's really just a delightful read. So what we'll do today is have Simon talk for 25 minutes. I'll give you 25, and if you go to 30, I'll hit the gavel. And then I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from everyone. And we have books, as you saw, out back. I have the hardback, which is right there, but you can buy the paperback. And he'll talk, and then we'll ask questions, and then he'll be available to sign copies, which you have with you. But let's give a warm welcome to Simon Winchester.
Well, about 15 years ago, I suppose, I was writing a book about the Yangtze, and spent a year just about traveling upstream from Shanghai to where it rises in Garandandong in Tibet. And when I got back to New York to write it, I was writing the chapter on the Three Gorges. And specifically, I was interested to know how junk, before the advent of power in the early part of the 20th century, how a sailing junk would have managed to get up through the ferocious currents in the 300-odd miles of the Three Gorges against the stream. I mean, the boats had to be very capacious and light, and they took an enormous amount of cargo between Wuhan and Chongqing. But what did they look like in the Ming and the Qing dynasties? And someone who knew a lot about ships said to me, well, there are 2 classic books that you must look at. One is The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze by G.R.G. Worcester, published in Annapolis in 1942. And the other was Volume 4, Part 3 of Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham. Now, I hadn't heard of either of these books, nor either of these writers, but I think that conversation must have taken place on a Friday, and the following day, a Saturday, I was up in Salisbury, Connecticut, where there was an absolutely wonderful bookstore called Lion's Head Books, which is one of those, a bookstore that has sort of everything, and run by a very knowledgeable bookseller called Mike McKay. The bookstore is now defunct, but Mike, I'm happy to say, is not defunct at all. But he was one of these booksellers who knew every book, it seemed, that had ever been published. And so I went up on Saturday morning and I said, Mike, I've got two rather obscure books. I wonder if at least you could know where I might get hold of them or whether you can order them for me. He said, okay, try me. And I said, well, the first one is it's called The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze. And he said, oh, you mean G.R.G. Worcester? And I said, yes, I think I do. And he said, yes, we normally have that in stock. He wasn't a maritime bookstore at all, but it was a very large format book, and he reached up to an upper shelf and pulled it down, $25. And I said, you're an amazing guy, Mike. Well, what's the second one? And he said, the second one, I said, I'm looking for Volume 4, Part 3 of something called Science and Civilization in China. And he looked at me as if I was, his expression completely changed. He looked as if I was something that the cat had dragged into the store. He said, you do of course mean Joseph Needham. And I said, I think that is the name, yes. And he said, are you telling me you've never heard of Joseph Needham? And I said, I'm afraid I haven't. And he said, well, you ought to be thoroughly ashamed of yourself, because he is the most famous Englishman ever to have lived in China. He wrote this extraordinary series of books, 20-odd volumes, I don't know how many, but an enormous series of books, completely changed the way, single-handedly, that the West thought of China. And he said, we never get complete sets. It's still in print, Cambridge University Press. It would cost thousands, but we occasionally get single volumes, and I think I remember one coming in a couple of years ago. So he, like the White Rabbit, disappeared down into his lair in the bottom of the shop and came back a few moments later with this enormous fat tome. He blew the dust off it, held it up to the light, Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham, Volume 4, Part 3, the very one that I wanted, $75. So I just blessed him for existence, and thought independent bookstores are wonderful things, and gave him a $100 bill, went out to the car, and it was pretty obvious what Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze was about, but what was Volume 4, Part 3, this massive book. And I cracked it open in the car and sat completely enthralled for an hour, it must have been an hour, 984 pages. Everything you'd ever want to know about China's historic relationship with water. So it was about the building of the Grand Canal and the design of rudders and navigation techniques at sea and the use of the compass and charts and the varied diagrams of the Ming and Qing sailing junks that went up the Yangtze. Absolutely everything. And I thought, my God, who on earth was this person who put this book together? And if what Mike McKay had said was to be believed, not just this volume, but 20-odd other volumes about astronomy and biology and chemistry and engineering and mathematics and metallurgy. Who was he? And I thought to myself, one day I would try and have a crack at writing a book about him. But I'm not a sinologist, I speak barely any Chinese, but I sort of kept it at the back of my mind. And then after I finished a book on the San Francisco earthquake in 2006, and realizing that 2008 was going to be the Olympic year when possibly there would be some piqued interest in matters Chinese, I thought I might have a go. So by this time I'd identified the keepers of the flame, of the Needham Flame, which is an institute in Cambridge, the Needham Research Institute. And I wrote to them and I said, I'm a writer who lives in America and I'm fascinated by this chap, but I'm not a sinologist, and I know that sinologists are really, regard their skill somewhat jealously. As it happened, the director, a man called Christopher Cullen, had read a book of mine, The Professor and the Madman, about the making of the Oxford English Dictionary, a similarly sort of epic project. And he thought that that worked very well, and he said, I think this would be a capital idea. So, yes, the trustees, I'll put it to them, they said yes, and so I went over to the NRI and to the University in Cambridge and started work on this extraordinary archive that they have that Joseph kept. Basically, and essentially, his diaries, which were had a beautiful writing hand, his entire story was laid out to me really quite easily in a way. So he turned out to be every bit as fascinating and remarkable a character as the books that he wrote. He was born in London in 1900, although how he was conceived I don't quite know, because his parents completely and cordially loathed each other. His father was a rather ascetic doctor, also called Joseph. He was an anaesthetist or anesthesiologist, as you say here. Wife number one died, but his second wife was, as far as one can see, completely insane. She was a drunkard. She sang at inappropriate moments. She spent like a drunken sailor. She threw crockery and knives. She was very violent. She was Irish and French, which I'm sure had absolutely nothing to do with this insanity. How they managed to have the necessary 30 minutes or so of peace and quiet to conceive a child, I don't know, but they must have done sometime around Easter 1900, because just before Christmas there was born to them this small child, and their disagreement continued to the font. Joseph wanted to call the child Noel because he was born at Christmas time, and Mother, for some obscure Irish reason, wanted to call it Terence. And so in the end they called him Noel Joseph Terence Montgomery Needham, and the little boy called himself Joseph, just out of a spirit of filial compromise. And he spent most of his early life up in the fourth floor nursery in their house in Clapham, being looked after by a rather gloomy French governess. But she taught him French, and indeed language became a very early thing that he was very adept at, such that by the time he was 13, I think, he could speak and read and write. I think it was 7 languages. So I mean, it was Latin and Greek. Obviously, he couldn't speak Latin, but he could read and write Greek and Latin. But French and German and Spanish, and also Polish and Russian, which is no mean achievement, having both rather difficult languages. And he also picked up rather other somewhat unusual skills. He became very good at driving steam railway trains. He loved railway trains, and he learned how to do this. His father had a lot of strange friends, and there was one, a surgeon, a very flamboyant surgeon called Sir John Bland Sutton, who came to the house frequently, and he was a great friend of Kipling, and so Kipling came to the house a lot. But Bland Sutton was a surgeon who, among other things, invented the hysterectomy, and he used to have young Joseph round to the operating theatre to help him perform operations and hand in catgut and scalpels and things, something I imagine liability lawyers, like the people who find in this building, wouldn't look too kindly on. But anyway, it meant that Joseph became very, very familiar with the nether regions of ladies, which was to stand him in very good stead later in his life. The Bland Sutton was also interested in another thing, rather more peculiar. He was very interested in the lemur, the Madagascan primate. And the lemur apparently has a predisposition to cataract. Who knew, but apparently they do. And Bland Sutton would perform surgery, pro bono one imagines, on afflicted lemurs, and would invite Joseph to attend the operations. So by the time he was sort of 16, he could speak 7 languages, he drive steam railway trains, he had a profound knowledge of the interior workings of women and of ocularly challenged lemurs. So he was clearly destined for a rather glittering academic career. He was also much affected by the mantras which his father would pin up all around the house. One of them, I mean, I'd heard of none of them, but one of them affects me very much to this day, which was never go upstairs empty-handed. I find that I can't see a staircase now without desperately looking for something to carry up it. Never have 3 helpings of anything. You can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. No knowledge is ever to be wasted or despised, which I think is very sensible. And when he went up to Oundle School in Northamptonshire, just north of London, the headmaster there, a remarkable educationalist, remarkable enough to have his own biography, he was called F.W. Sanderson, written by H.G. Wells, so he was a rather formidable character. He also pumped Needham full of aphorisms, of which the most notable was, my boy, he said, put aside the pettifogging and the little details, think big, think in oceans, which I think is a lovely mantra. This clearly did remain with Needham all his life, as you'll see. Well, he went up to Cambridge, he breezed in because he was so clever. He went to Caius College, which the college made famous by the film Chariots of Fire, which I expect most of you have seen. And he went up initially to read medicine, but he was swiftly told that, I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying so, that medicine was a very non-intellectual pursuit, and that the future, my boy, another mantra, lies in atoms and molecules, and so he switched to chemistry. And he got a passing third degree in chemistry, good enough to allow him to go to a PhD in biochemistry. And the Institute of Biochemistry in Cambridge at the time was run by a remarkable man called Frederick Gowland Hopkins, who went on to win the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamins in 1928. So the Institute was clearly a very sort of leading edge, cutting edge kind of place. And Needham, then his mind really began to expand, and people noted him as a polymathic kind of figure, the Erasmus of his age, someone remarked. So he got his PhD fairly swiftly, and at a very early age, only 24, he was elected to a fellowship at Keys, which meant that his academic position was secure really for the rest of his life. He didn't have to worry. He had a beautiful room which he was to keep for the next 75 years, a room which he inherited. It's in the, I don't know if many of you know Keys, but in the main court, staircase K, room 1, ground floor. It used to be a zoologist, a man called Sir William Bate Hardy, and he died, and Needham took it over when he was elected to the fellowship. And when Needham died in 1995, it passed to the person who occupies it today, which is the cosmologist Stephen Hawking. So it's a rather nice sort of illustration of the continuity of intellectual life at Cambridge. So Needham then began research on something which he probably would have continued work on for the rest of his days, which was the egg. He was an embryologist, working out how something made of shell and albumin and white transforms itself into feathers and beaks and blood and whatever chickens are made of. And so that's what he did. And it was during this period that the eccentricities for which he's become known started to develop. Some of them not eccentricities. I mean, but essential parts of his character. He was much affected in 1917 by the Bolshevik Revolution and became a Marxist, never a card-carrying member of the party, but very, very determinedly and militantly left-wing, and he always was for the rest of his life. But he was very much a builder of bridges between his mother and father, between East and West, between China and the outside world, and between Marxism and one of its opposites, which is, of course, Christianity. And he became a very, very keen and sincere Christian. Had some difficulty finding a church with a left-wing bent, but he did in the end. He found one in a village outside Cambridge called Saxted, which was run by a remarkable left-wing vicar called Conrad Noel, who was himself rather eccentric. He used to preach his sermons with a parrot on his shoulder, and would do sort of mischievous things like run the flag of Sinn Féin up to the top of the steeple just to show solidarity with Irish Home Rule, and this would prompt sort of right-wing louts from Cambridge to come down and climb up the steeple and pull the offending flag down, and that meant the police were called and there were riots in this village, and Needham thought it was absolutely wonderful. So he was also an early, he espoused something which in the 1920s was given the polite name of gymnosophy. This was the word for nudism. He loved taking his clothes off at every possibility, from a socialist point of view, that when you divest yourself of your silks and satins, you are at one with your fellow man, or minus a few bits, with your brother or sister, female. So he took his clothes off all the time. The encouragement of Conrad Noel's wife, he became a very keen practitioner of Morris dancing, which I don't know if you, and a very big expert on it, this bizarre form of pagan dancing where you attach straw and bells to your wrists and ankles and dance around, gyrate rather than dance, by beating sticks together, and someone plays a tuneless dirge on a pipe. Mercifully, he doesn't seem to have performed this naked, but he did also take up and became very good at playing the accordion. Someone mentioned to me early on that, thank God, being a nudist, he didn't take up the cymbals. The accordion would do much the same, only rather more slowly. He was also a chain smoker all his life, and he lived till 95. But he always ascribed his longevity to the fact that he never smoked a cigarette before noon. He would balance the cigarette on his desk, and when the clock in the court at Keys, which played such a part in Chariots of Fire, struck the final bell, he picked it up and lit it and smoked like industrial Manchester for the rest of the day. And he was also, and this is a rather important point to say, he was also an avowed and unrepentant and committed womanizer. He loved women, and they loved him. He was very tall and handsome in a sort of Harry Potterish way. He looked like, with those spectacles, he looked like sort of Harry Potter on amphetamines. And the Institute of Biochemistry was said by someone to be full of clever Jews and talkative young women, and he loved the Jews. He really loved the women, and he worked his way through most of them until he settled on one daughter of a Quaker from Devon. She was called Dorothy Moyle, and while he was working on the eggs, she was working on the mechanics of muscles, what happens when you flex them. And they courted and eventually married on Friday the 13th of September in a sort of flouting convention. And he made this speech at the reception, which I think somewhat surprised Dorothy, in which he said, "Ours, my dear, is to be a thoroughly modern marriage. We're not to be hidebound by the rather tedious conventions of bourgeois fidelity and things like that. So either of us has, friends of extracurricular friends, that's to be certainly condoned and perhaps even encouraged." Well, looking at her diaries, which were in Girton College, Cambridge, there's no evidence at all that she ever strayed from the path of marital rectitude, but the same cannot be said of Joseph, who, from the moment they returned from their honeymoon, seems to have hit